Hey, hello guys, and welcome back to my YouTube show. And today, in our history of the Soviet Union, I am going to talk about, was communism a disaster? So, from my point of view, communism was a disaster in many ways because it took a lot of people's innocent lives, and a lot of people were devastated in those communist nations like the Soviet Union, North Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba. And so a lot of people suffered from communism, and the communists did a lot of bad things to those people. And so communism is basically a belief in which you believe something is uh, owned, owned by everybody in the government. So basically, communism, for example, like everything would be like to the government. So like agriculture would be owned by government, the industries would be owned by government, uh, the TVs were owned by government, the houses were owned by government. So everything was all under government control. That's what basically communism is, when everything is owned by everybody in the government. So that's what basically communism means. And so capitalism is a different thing. Capitalism is when everything is owned by privately by private individuals. But I'm going to talk about that maybe later on in the future. So anyway, back to, was communism a disaster? So communism was a belief that was created by Karl Marx, who was a German philosopher. He received his PhD. I think it was in Germany when he was studying there. It was in 1882. He wrote his book about Das Kapital, which was a book about capitalism and that was going to spread and how to stop capitalism. I think that's what the book was about. And so some of the followers of the Das Kapital, I think some of the guys, some of the Russian revolutionaries or Bolsheviks at the time, it was Lenin. Lenin read the book of Lenin read the book of Das Kapital, and he came up with his own ideas about how to overthrow the Russian Empire and to create a revolution there and create Russia the first communist nation. And so it was a bunch of other Lenin's followers became interested in that revolution, and so they started planning against the Russian Empire, which was under the Nicholas. I think it was either Nicholas the Third, or yeah, it was Nicholas the Third. He was assassinated in July of 1918, I believe. Yeah, 1918. So shortly before the war and shortly before World War One ended. So anyway, the it was kind of like disastrous because like communism, like towards the end of World War One, was like spreading in Russia, and so Russia became the first communist nation in the world to have that belief. So Russia was the mother of all communism. It was the first communist nation in the world to have that. And so that was like very it was devastating. And then so under the Stalin time, like a lot of people were being killed under the Stalin time. It was very disastrous because like over millions of his own people were killed by him. And so that was known as the Great Purges. That lasted from 1936 to 1939. And so a lot of people's lives were taken away by Stalin, and he killed millions of his own Soviet citizens. So that was very devastating what was going on during that time. And so the Soviet troops or Soviet citizens and Soviet generals and Soviet politicians who were against Stalin were executed. They were wiped off the face of the earth by Stalin, which was horrible, very very horrible dictatorship under Stalin. And so during most of Stalin's rule as leader of Soviet Union, he transformed the Soviet Union from industrial power into a superpower, in which he transformed the nation from an industrial power, in which like everything the industries produces is made like out of like machines and stuff like that, and he transformed the Soviet Union into a superpower, in which he created the USSR with nuclear weapons, nuclear bombs, and just testing them, and then they created nuclear missiles, and now that would begin the Cold War shortly after World War II in 1948, from what I remember, from what I recall from that time, from what I recall reading some resources. And so, like towards the end of World War II, the communism was starting to spread into Eastern Europe because it was because the countries that were the Eastern Europe was liberated by Soviet Union, and so communism started to spread into the Eastern Europe. Like for example, the East Germany, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Hungary, um, Czechoslovakia. What else? Um, yeah, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, East Germany, Poland, Hungary, um, Hungary, and a bunch of others that were in Eastern Europe that were liberated by the Soviets. And so the West was under capitalist control because it was they were liberated by the Western powers like the United States and Britain and France. And so those countries came under their control. They were basically in power of those countries. And so that was like, I think that was the time shortly after World War II ended, and that was the time when the Cold War began. And so like that was kind of like that was kind of like, not, I wouldn't say horrifying. That was just a new tension that was going on. That started the Cold War, in which the United States and the Soviet Union started to threaten each other for 40 years, and the world would be on the fear of nuclear war. So that was kind of devastating. That was kind of horrifying, actually, to live through the Cold War time for 40 years of your life and you were scared about having a nuclear war during those 40 years. And so like that, and then so like there was a lot of propaganda about capitalism and communism going on, saying that it was good, and the communists were saying that communism is good, it's the best, but in reality they were basically lying. They brainwashed people in Soviet Union and the other Eastern Bloc countries that were under the Soviets' influence. And so United States, and there was a lot of posters about communism, and they were saying that it was bad and it was horrible. But then also at the time it was kind of horrifying, because there was an investigation going on about if some Americans were involved in communism and they were a member of the Communist Party or whatever. And there was an investigation going on. That was an FBI investigation, and that was known as the Red Scare. And a lot of people lost their jobs because they were interested in communism during that time in the 1950s in the United States. And so that was called as McCarthyism. McCarthy was a senator, and he was involved with communism, and then some of the people that were interested in communism were arrested and they were thrown into the jail. And so, like during most of the 1950s, the United States rival was the Soviet Union, because they were against each other, because they had different beliefs of different political beliefs, basically. And so that was the United States' number one enemy, the Soviet Union, in the 1950s. That was the US's major enemy, basically. And so by 1950s, that was when shortly before 1950s, that was when communism started to spread into North Korea, because that was liberated by the Soviet Union, and the South was liberated by the United States, and that fell under the influence of capitalism. And so that started the North Korean War. Korean War. That was fought between North Korea and South Korea. North Korea's leader was Kim Il-sung, who was the dictator of North Korea. He was the communist dictator of not Cuba, North Korea. And so the president of South Korea was Syngman Rhee, who was the president of South Korea for some time. And so the North and South Koreas would be at war at each other for 3 years, from 1950 to 1953. And so the war was won, and South Korea won the war, and the Korean Peninsula was divided. It was the 38th parallel, and that divided North and South Korea, which those two nations still remain to this day still. And so even before that, a lot of Kim Il-sung's people were killed by him. He was like a brutal dictator, like Joseph Stalin was in the old Soviet Union when he was leader of the Soviet Union from 1924 to 1953. So he was leader for a long period of time. Stalin was leader of Soviet Union for 30 years. And Kim Il-sung was leader or dictator of North Korea from 1948 all the way until his death in 1941. So he was dictator for almost 40 years. That's 40 years. That's longer compared to Joseph Stalin, when Stalin was the general secretary of the Communist Party of the USSR. And so communism did a lot of damage to Soviet Union, to North Korea, to Vietnam, China, and a lot of people were just killed by these people. It was very horrible, and it was not good. And so, and even in China, the communists took power in 1949, and so this communist led by Mao Zedong, he was the chairman of the Communist Party of the China, and so he managed to take power of China, and the nationalist government of China fled to Taiwan because they were against communism. And that government still remains in Taiwan to this day still. And so so during that time, it was like very horrible. And then so like when Mao was in power, a lot of people were being killed. That was being the cultural revolution that took place in the 1960s. That was to get rid of any capitalists influence in China. And so a lot of people were killed in China who supported capitalism, and during Mao's rule. That was I think the Cultural Revolution lasted from 1966 all the way until 1967. So about 10 years that Cultural Revolution was going on. And then in Cuba, there was a revolution going on there. That was in 1959. That was when Fidel Castro took power in the Cuba. And so during his rule, he was dictator of Cuba for some time, from Khrushchev all the way to Brezhnev, and then all the way until the 2000s when the Cold War was over. And so like he was a brutal dictator. For example, like the Bay of Pigs invasion, like Kennedy sent this trained group of trained Cuban exiles that were trained by the CIA. And so they went to the Bay of Pigs. They invaded the Bay of Pigs Island, and they were captured by Fidel Castro, and they were tortured, and they were thrown into the jail, which was kind of horrible. And so you see, communism did a lot of damage to the world during those 40, 50, 60 years during the Cold War. I mean, during the Cold War and before the Cold War. So communism did a lot of damage to those countries during those years. And communism is not a big deal now. Communism is not like a big influence like it was during the Cold War. It's not like a major of the biggest thing now than it was compared to the Cold War time. Because there's only like few communist nations left. There's like North Korea, China, Vietnam, and Cuba. And those are the only communist countries that are left today. So they're not like communism is not like a big deal than it was compared to them. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. So please drop a like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in my next history video, or maybe my other videos or something. So I'll see you guys there. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.